Now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you for staying tuned to the second hour of the show here live on the Inception Radio Network. Don't forget, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer. And if you have missed an episode, please do check out our archives at www.energyradio.com. Like us on Facebook, where you can keep informed of all the upcoming shows, or sign up for our weekly newsletter. We also have a YouTube channel, which is Just Energy Radio on YouTube. And please, if you go check out the shows there, subscribe to the channel so I know that you're listening to the show. I'd really appreciate that. Also, you can download the Inception Radio Network app for your phone. You know, I like to say you can listen to it in your car while you're at work. Working. I mean, you'll be working hard, but listening to the great programming that we have here on this network. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about our second hour guest and get him on the air, because this is going to be another really exciting conversation. So we're going to be talking to Rick Osmon about ancient fortresses, or ancient stuff. I'm just going to call it ancient stuff in America. Rick Osmon was selected for the U.S. Air Force Academy right out of high school. He worked for defense contractors a number of years and then took a job with the U.S. Navy as a civilian with an engineering support field activity specializing in radar, night vision, and laser equipment for surveillance and munition guidance. But all those years, Rick was also reading everything he could find about the weird and unusual: history, archaeology, paleontology, geography, cartography, cryptozoology, I'll skip that word, and hollow earth theory. And we're going to talk about his book, Graves of the Golden Bear. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio, Rick Osmon. Hey, Rick, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. And you did pretty well. You did really well reading that.
And, you know, I'm pretty dyslexic, and people that listen to my show regular, I usually screw stuff up. And I just wasn't going to hang myself up on that one word. It was
good plan.
Move along. Just move along. But I am going to say, I'm going to give myself a little pat on the back for people that have listened to my show for a long time, like Jim. I know you're out there. I think my reading people's intro has greatly improved over the years, because it used to be horrid, just horrid. But it's better. It's way better. Anyway.
It gets Rick, better with practice, just like almost everything.
So how did you get into this whole thing in the first place? You know, you were in the military complex. I used to be in the military complex, worked for defense contractors. But how did you get into this whole ancient mystery, cryptozoology, hollow earth thing?
Well, when I was a kid, I started getting interested in history when I was probably 10 or 11. By the time I was 13 or 14, I'd hooked up with the local town fathers, who were the repositories of all the local history, and both of them told me the tale of 10 or 12 ancient fortresses that crossed Indiana, and nobody knew why, and nobody knew exactly who. But from there, you know, when I was 16, I got a driver's license and a girlfriend, and everything went away for a while. But after I got done with my career, so to speak, I picked it up again actively and track down the two that are actually well documented in the 19th century literature. One is at Merrim, Indiana. And the other one is 14 Mile Island, also known as Rose Island, also known as Devil's Backbone, and it's 3 miles southeast of Charlestown, Indiana. And they're very well documented. Archaeological surveys, both places are fortresses.
Okay, now let me just stop you real quick right there, because when I think America, you know, kind of Midwest, I think, okay, I love art history, I love anthropology, but just like regular history, not so much. You know, but I think like Custer and, you know, you know, I'm trying to think of that TV show with, you know, the Hakawi Indians, you know, but, you know, that's what I think.
F-Troop.
F-Troop. That's what I think. So are we talking about American forts? I mean,
no, we're not.
What are we talking about here?
We're talking about forts that existed in ancient times before Columbus. Okay. And in the case of the one at Devil's Backbone, it was stone, and it guarded or barricaded, palisaded. Palisade's the wrong word because palisade implies wood reinforcement. Anyway, it had a stone wall 10 feet, 12 feet tall, and 561 feet long, about, and up to 50 feet wide on top. And overlooked, or guarded a bluff that was 210 feet, is still 210 feet above the river of the Ohio River. So it was definitely there as a fortress for a military purpose of some kind, whether it was guarding the river, controlling traffic, or taxing travelers, or whatever it might have been. It was well situated for the task. So, I mean,
I think that's kind of weird because when we look at Native American cultures, you know, I am not aware of, okay, and I'll say it that way, I am not aware of other situations where they did things in that way.
Well, they're not either. And that's kind of where the story gets weird, because when early Americans, and even British and French before them, asked who built all these fortresses, the most common answer went something to the effect, well, they were tall, they had red hair, and they spoke Welsh, and they were such a pain in the ass, we gathered them all up and killed them. And that's a paraphrase, but that's pretty much the gist of the story they got from Chief Tobacco, Chief Cornstalk, and a few others in the period of when George Rogers Clark, that's General George Rogers Clark, who would know a fortress when he saw one, asked Cornstalk about it because they were drinking buddies. And Clark responded to a letter from some researcher and described the fortress and the conversation with Cornstalk. In the case of Miram, it's actually from an I have archaeological surveys for both places, and they were definitely fortresses. 13 acres enclosed at Devil's Backbone with gardens, etc., etc. So it could be, you know, siege resistant. And it had a harbor where the creek meets the river. So it was definitely a fortress. So from that, I said we need more information to establish whether there were really 10 or 12 fortresses. So I wrote an article for Ancient American Magazine, and Wayne May was kind enough to publish it. And I described the local history of a Welsh colony via Prince Madoc of Wales. And that would take an hour just to explain that one. But at the end of the article, I said, if anybody has on their property or knows of stone walls near a river on a bluff, something that would be suited for a defensive position, please get a hold of me. And one guy did. And I went and invited me over to look at it, and I went, and there are definitely some enigmatic features there. Large stone walls, 15 feet tall, 60 feet long, about 12 to 14 feet thick at the base, and about 3 feet thick at the top. And they have a notch in them for some purpose. Not all of them do, but 3 of them do. Yeah.
So you're thinking that there might, this is a 2-part thing, because we know about, obviously, the Native Americans who discovered America first. And then, we've heard about the Vikings coming. But, I mean, having the Welsh be here, that's kind of a new one to me. And it would be more congruent with a group coming out of Europe to build a fort than what I would think coming out of Native American culture building a fort.
That's where it starts getting really interesting, because in about the middle to late 6th century AD, populations, civilizations, countries all over the world, even city-states, started building fortifications. They would wall off their city. And there were also groups that were on the move. You had the Huns moving from east to west, and you had the Saxons moving from Europe to Great Britain, I'm sorry, not Saxons. Um, and it was, something was up. And it's the very beginning of what we call the Dark Ages. Well, an acquaintance of mine wrote a book entitled Man and the Impact in the Americas. And it's about a tsunami that impacted the East Coast, and we know that from the geology that there really was one in about 536 AD, about, plus or minus quite a few years. But so anyway, we know there was this impact, and there was also the beginning of the Dark Ages, and the hypothesis is that the term Dark Ages started out actually describing the skies, that this, whatever this event was, probably an extraterrestrial impact event, threw up such a dust cloud that it blacked out the skies of the northern hemisphere, or parts of it anyway. And it certainly laid waste to much of the British Isles. So had this population that was starving, basically. And it was so bad even the Saxons quit attacking for about 20 years because there was nothing there to capture. And so this colony from Wales ends up in what is now the United States. The most prominent tale is that they entered at Mobile Bay and fought their way to the Ohio River and settled there at Devil's Backbone, and eventually got run out of it and were massacred on an island about 12 miles south or downriver from that site, from 14 Mile Island site. And a lot of maybe collaborative evidence exists for a Welsh incursion. However, I maintain that they didn't have enough boats to move enough people, 2 or 3 year period. So my contention is that they knew about fortresses that already existed from the Roman era, from the Britanno-Roman era.
In America.
In America.
Okay, but now we're talking about almost 2,000 years ago.
We're talking about 117 AD to about 142 AD.
That's almost 2,000.
Yeah, it's close enough.
Plus or minus, 300 years.
Yeah. In 117 AD, history ceases to acknowledge the existence of the Ninth Roman Legion, which was stationed at that time in Yorkshire, England, and had built that fortress in 108, a stone fortress in 108, beginning in 108. And they had previously built a wooden fortress there in 79 AD. And then suddenly in 117, they simply disappear from history. All except one figure who shows back up in 142 AD, appointed governor of what the Romans called Arabia Petraeus, what we call today the city of Petra. And Petra is, you've all, I'm sure you and 99% of your audience have seen the Indiana Jones movie, Search for the Holy Grail, or whatever the exact title is, with the old knight in the cave, and they ride through this canyon and come up on
I thought that place was just a set. That they had just built this set, and then, they said the name of it, and someone goes, "Oh no, that's a real place." I'm like, "No way," because I had never seen that before that movie.
Right, most people had not, and it gets a lot deeper than we can actually go into in even in the next 40 minutes. But it's a very important place for another period of history later on that involved the Knights Templar. We might come back to that. But in 142 AD, a guy by the name of Lucius Aemilius Carus is appointed governor of Arabia Petraeus. Now, he, in 117, was one of the mid to upper echelon officers with the Ninth Roman Legion. So we know they didn't all die or get captured or whatever. And there's pretty much no mention of anybody else surviving that intervening 25 years. Anyway, so Petra is a natural geological toll booth, and anybody who passed through that canyon had to pay a toll, and that's why that treasury, and that's what it was, the treasury, that giant carved from living stone edifice, was a Roman treasury. And it was administered by this Lucius Aemilius Carus. Now, he might have had, I don't know, a quarter of a century of experience in administering such natural geological toll booths if he could control traffic on the rivers of North America. And that's where all these fortresses are, is on the rivers of North America.
And they were going to get like some beads or something?
No, they would get furs and feathers and maybe even green crude from northwestern Pennsylvania, mica, copper, lots of copper. Mm-hmm. The Michigan copper, which is, a bad bunch, is 95% pure copper. More typically, it's 99.7% pure copper, and the contaminants in it is silver.
Well, hurt my feelings with that, right?
Yeah. Well, anyway, so there's 15,000 or so ancient copper mines in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan and on Isle Royal out in Lake Superior. And there isn't nearly enough copper in the Native American cultures, plural and cumulative, to account for all the copper that would have been removed from those mines.
Well, I mean, were Native American tribes working metal? I mean, were they making like copper spearheads?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So there was a use in the current time, where in that time period they still weren't using stone spearheads.
Well, they were using mixed, but copper would work better for some things, but usually it was more utilitarian. In fact, just recently, a gentleman in Wisconsin had found what he believed to be a tool for drawing maple syrup out of trees and collecting it to make, or maple sap out of the trees and making maple syrup. So he had this artifact, ancient copper artifact, replicated with modern copper and tried it out, and it works like a champ. So and it's basically rolled copper. Kind of a tube, just a round tube on one end, kind of a spoon-shaped end opposite that you push into the bark.
So pretty simple, but effective.
Very. Both counts. And it lasted, 5,000-7,000 years in the ground in Wisconsin. So it's pretty durable.
Mm-hmm.
So, but what happened to the rest of it? There could be as much as, some estimates go to 5 billion pounds of copper.
Well, they shipped it to Egypt so that they could build the pyramids with their copper tools.
Right. They carved a lot of granite with copper.
Yeah.
Mostly they carved a lot of copper with granite, but...
Well, I mean, so you've talked about these fortresses, but in the area, I'm thinking, behind the wall. I don't know, it could be in front of the wall too. I mean, did they find any human remains? Did they find, I'm going to say, any pottery or any other kind of artifacts that would connect whoever was there to a European or a Roman civilization?
Well, yes, actually, but they don't like to talk about those things.
Well, yeah, but we do.
We certainly do. And one of the most important classes of those kinds of evidence, in my opinion, is the similarity and contemporaneity of graves in this Ohio Valley culture that modern American archaeologists call Mississippian, and the contemporary culture that was in Wales. They buried the people the same way. In Wales, they call it a slab-sided grave, and in America, in the Ohio Valley in particular, they call it a stone box grave. So you can go find images of these. You can go find everything online free that says, yeah, they're contemporary and they're extremely similar in construction. And some of the Mississippian graves had skulls that certainly looked a lot more European than Native American, particularly Roman nose skulls.
Has anybody ever tried doing any DNA analysis on them, or is that a secret?
No. Well, if they have, it is a secret. But let's put it this way. You cannot do that legally now because of a law called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It went into effect in, I believe, 1996. And it was a huge fight at one point over a set of remains recovered from the area of Kennewick, Washington. And it's known as...
where they found the Kennewick stone?
Kennewick Man.
Kennewick Man. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you're probably thinking of the Kensington runestone.
Yeah. But I mean, yeah. But I knew about that one too, but you get stuff mixed up. So.
Well, it's kind of my business to try to keep it straight. Kennewick Man was carbon dated to roughly 8,640 some years before present. So he's an old dude. Mm-hmm. And when the forensic pathologist, his name is Jim Chatters, forensic anthropologist, when he gathered the remains, he said, wow, this is a Caucasian dude. And he was figuring, no more than a couple hundred years at the gravesite. But when he started doing further investigation, he found an 8,000-year-old spear point embedded in the dude's hip bone. Well,
so I guess they bumped him off too.
Well, he was bumped off. But anyway, he had survived a lot of attacks before. Mm-hmm. And that one was actually healed over. He carried that thing for most of his adult life. But when Jim wanted to do DNA, because he kept in constant contact with the coroner, who kept in constant contact with the sheriff's office, who'd kept in constant contact with the Department of the Army, who owned the lake or the river where he was found, the feds came in and confiscated all the evidence under NAGPRA, because he was now 9,000 years old. Therefore, he couldn't be anything but a Native American and protected by NAGPRA.
But wouldn't the Native American Confederation have any kind of jurisdiction over that, and couldn't they give their permission?
They could, but they have not. There are 5 tribes who cited in a lawsuit with the Department of the Army and Department of the Interior, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service. A whole bunch of them got in on it. And the wording of NAGPRA left an opening for the judge to say, in this case, science overrides, because none of the tribes could show a clear kinship to someone 9,000 years old. Mm-hmm. So the remains are still in the custody, I should say, under the administrative custody of the United States government and the Army Corps of Engineers. But they're being preserved at, I believe it's Washington State University, but I'd have to look that one up to be sure. Mm-hmm. They get inspected once a year to make sure they're still there and still in good shape. And that's all that has been done. Preserved for science, yes, but they won't.
For science, that won't touch it.
Correct. Sure. But what's interesting is the people who sued to keep the remains available for science. It included Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian Institution. It included, well, of course, Jim Chatters, but there were 7 prominent scientists that signed on for this case, all of them at risk for ridicule, etc. And about the only person who's really suffered from it is Jim Chatters, because up until that point, he had a really good working relationship with all the tribes around there. I guess that kind of went by the wayside.
So, well, we've had 2 questions in the chat room. They both had to do with Wisconsin, so I'm just going to throw them both together.
Sure.
Okay, so when we were talking about the maple syrup tool, one of the questions was, where in Wisconsin was that found? And then the other one was about burial mounds in Wisconsin. And I had some questions about burial mounds in general, so I'm going to throw this in at the same time, and maybe you can just cover everything. Because there are the grave mounds, the burial mounds that we find all over the United States. And do you think there might be a connection between those grave mounds and the ones that we find, like, in the UK?
Well, in some cases, yes. In most cases, no. The burial mounds in the UK primarily are Scotland and Ireland. And the mounds in most of England, what we now call England, was once Britannia, are flat-top conical mounds. Those are the bigger ones. There are some burial mounds, yes. The flat-top conicals, very big, Alvaberry, quite a few of them. And the flat-top conical mounds in what is now the United States, particularly at Moundsville, West Virginia. There's one very near me here in Vincennes, Indiana. Another one in the next county north of me. They are numerous, and they are pretty much identical, not only in construction, but also in placement, or at least the strategy of placement, because they form a line of sight so that you can, if you know how to do the cipher and master the technology, which is basically a lantern with a louver over it, you can act as a relay operator, just as the early telegraph operators did, receiving a message and passing it along to the next operator. And they sent messages across the United States by telegraph in a matter of minutes.
So kind of like the giant smoke signal, or, I'm sure everyone saw Lord of the Rings where, they set the tower, the fire, and then it goes across. I mean, the cinematography on that scene was just awesome, and going from mountain peak till it got to Gondor to let them know that they were needed in Rohan. Yeah. Or backwards.
Whichever. But actually, that was low tech. As early as the 1st century BC, Rome was using a line of sight communication system, using polished mirrors in the daytime and using louvered lanterns at night. And they could send messages all across the Roman Empire in basically a matter of hours. And that is held up by historical accounts. When Claudius invaded, quote unquote, invaded Britain, he sent word back to Rome that he needed another full legion, meaning 5,400 troops and probably up to 10,000 retinue altogether.
So are we talking like Morse code kind of thing?
Yes.
Oh, how cool. How cool.
And the historical account goes a little further than that, because the date that he sent the message shows up as the date they received the message in Rome. So...
so that's
pretty quick to go all the way across Europe and halfway down the Italian peninsula.
Mm-hmm. I wonder why they never did that. Well, I mean, I guess after the Romans, that whole practice, for the most part, except for what you're talking about here in the Americas, kind of went away.
It did, and that's another thing that contributed to the phrase the Dark Ages. Now, in the Americas, they didn't have nearly as good a metallurgy infrastructure as they had in Europe, but they did have an alternative that worked for the polished mirror role, and that is a piece of mica. Now, in all the grave mounds, as opposed to the flat-top conical utilitarian mounds, a lot of the elite burials included a great deal of mica, usually substantially sized sheets, big enough you could use it as a hand mirror type of thing. Mm-hmm. Okay, so taking this line of thought just a little further, during the Civil War, the Union developed what they called a heliograph, and this device captured sunlight and sent line-of-sight light-based messages across distances. Now, it wasn't very effective in the woodlands of the eastern United States, east of the Mississippi, because there were too damn many trees in the way. But during the Indian Wars, up into the 1870s, they took it out west, and they succeeded in sending messages near real time over distances of hundreds of miles with nothing but mirrors. Not even smoke and mirrors, just mirrors. But what was really interesting is that within a couple of years of deployment of the system, the Native Americans were intercepting the messages and had broken the cipher. So.
Oops.
Yeah, well, it's like the...
or maybe I should be like, go Native Americans.
Well, the other thing is that some of the Native Americans had learned, I don't know if they ever made it work, because if they did, the Army has never acknowledged such, but the Native Americans would also have learned by the 1870s what John Hunt Morgan had done to the Union when he invaded Indiana. And that was, he took control of the telegraph, and they'd send a guy up the pole with their own clicker, and they'd send false messages. It was a good tactic, I guess. And there's nothing stupid about any Native Americans. I can cite a half a dozen instances where they just downright embarrassed the United States Army. And deservedly so in most of those cases. Uh-huh. But the idea that nobody in ancient America had any technological acumen is just simply false. The hydrological stuff that has come to light, just how they managed water, and used water for power in some cases, and how they managed to perform and carry out aquaculture, as an example.
And so we're talking about North America, USA. I mean, because I know like in Mesoamerica and definitely in South America, they had the whole irrigation thing, and they were very good with working with water. But we're talking USA, correct?
We are talking USA.
Okay, just want to be clear with that. I mean, because, it's interesting, and let me just throw this in. When we think of anything going on in the New World, we think of the Maya, we think of the Olmec, we think of the Inca, and pretty much anybody else. I mean, in the USA, we don't think they had anything, a teepee and a blanket for smoke signals, and that was it.
Right, and that is partly because of the disinformation campaign that was in conjunction with a philosophy that finally was named Manifest Destiny. It is the United States' manifest destiny to civilize all of the territory from coast to coast. That came about in part due to Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act of 1830. You couldn't just move them off. You had to make them look like they didn't amount to anything at all. And that's what he did. And moved them out by force, by armed force. And with the Cherokee, you had what is now known as the Trail of Tears, which is about 110 miles south of me for the nearest point in Kentucky. But they lost nearly 2/3 of the Indian, lost them in transit to death, freezing, famine, disease. So only about a third of them actually made it to the reservations in Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was just the tail end of things. It had been ongoing for a very long time. When the British were influencing or trying to influence certain bands, they would offer them gifts, blankets infected with, smallpox, as an example, which didn't work, but it was tried. But one thing that did work, and is just absolutely disgusting, is they would give the tribes pacifiers for their babies made of lead.
Are you kidding?
No.
Oh, I mean, I to be honest, I'm kind of really not shocked.
It's downright embarrassing to me, but it's part of a historic effort to erase history. And there is a very legal reason for it. It doesn't make it ethical, just legal. And it has to do with going all the way back to 1452 with a papal bull that was issued to primarily, strictly Christian countries, obviously, that if you go someplace and there are no Christians in that land, you can claim it for your country, split with the church, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody you find there who is not a Christian, they're not Christians, you can do anything to them you want. Well, they changed part of that by 1500 and said, no, this enslavement thing isn't quite working out. But basically, the land claims were still held as valid. And that put into the language Christian lands, all right, into the legalese, if you will. If they're Christian lands, you can't make a claim on them. So, if there were Christians in North America at any time, and that could be proven, then all the land claims stemming from Spanish, French, English to United States might be null and void.
See, my husband says the exact same thing, so it must be true.
Well,
but it makes sense. I mean, it gives them ground to take action, where now it's like it's unheard of that they have any claim to anything, which doesn't make any sense to me, but...
Right. And if you go back to a land claim that goes all the way back, take it all the way back to its first iteration, it's either reserved for the tribes, that's what a reservation is, or you bought it, or one of your predecessors bought it from the United States government.
Mm-hmm.
Or it was granted by the United States government to people who already owned it before the Revolution. And at the very beginning, and there are actually court cases to this effect, in the beginning, it was God. It was God's country, and God gave it to the Christian church. That's what that amounts to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so because I'm looking at the clock and we have not enough time. Well, all right, not enough time because we're talking about America, and I have heard multiple stories about giants in America. And, and there are stories about giants other places, but the stories always seem like they're really old. David and Goliath and the Amorites. They're old. But it sounds like when we talk about giants in America that we're talking kind of contemporary. I mean, what do you know about that?
Well, just by examples, there is one giant burial mound with a giant in it at one time, just about 20 miles from me, in Pike County, Indiana. It was found in 1818, and uniquely, by one account, which came from the Western Sun newspaper. It was one of the first burials in that township at all in historical times. And when they started digging, they hit a coffin, and it was overlain. It was actually sheathed inside and out with copper plate, and it was oak inside the plate. And there were actually 2 or 3 bodies, depending on which account you're reading, inside. One was an 8-foot 4.5-inch giant with red hair and a copper breastplate, and between his legs was nestled this 4.5 or so foot woman, probably Native American, judging by hair color, and an infant was nested between her legs in one of the accounts. And there were copper beads and a few other baubles, and that's the word they used, baubles. So we have, and the people who are named in the newspaper account as being present at the burial would be consistent, first of all, with a burial in a brand new township, and the names are historically verifiable because one of them was a township trustee. So that's just one case and very local to me. You had others in Brewersville, Indiana, which is over closer to the Ohio line. And dozens across northern Indiana into Ohio, New York, Kentucky, Tennessee, Lovelock, Nevada, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Yeah, hundreds of newspaper accounts at the very least. But what most people won't tell you is that there are also dozens in the Journal of the Smithsonian Institution,
which has disappeared for forever.
Pretty much. Actually, you can still find reprints now and then, but they don't want to talk about it.
So let me ask a question about that burial that you were just talking about. You know, because the dissenters about a lot of this material will say, well, you know, there are people that have, you know, they just grow very tall. You know, they have a pituitary issue, and so they're giants.
Yeah, but there are also non-pituitary giants, and there's one in fairly recent history. His name was Angus McGaskill, and he went on tour with Barnum Bailey, and he was 7'9" as measured at his autopsy, claimed 7'11", and he was on tour with General Tom Thumb, who was 22 inches tall, and both adults. But Angus McGaskill was not a pituitary giant. He was just a very large individual and very strong individual. He once picked up and carried a 1,000-pound ship's anchor.
Okay, but this is my question. So in that burial, did they, you know, was the person, did they give any information about the people that were supposedly buried? You know, I mean, because I think it would be interesting if there was, you know, this is Frank, you know, Joe the barber's son who died kind of thing.
Well, there are no reports of any written material of any kind. Now, copper is actually a pretty good material for scratching something in it, but if it had been in the ground for, you know, 600,000-800,000 years, there wouldn't be much left. Mm-hmm. It would all be green or black. But in the case of the description, again, we have some fairly sober people reporting it. You know, one's responsible enough, he was elected township trustee. So he's got to be, you know, the pillar of that tiny community and probably not going to lie about it much. Mm-hmm. And you have similar things throughout the hundreds of accounts. Typically, they're dug up in mounds. There are just a few exceptions. Lovelock, Nevada was a cave burial. And one of the questions was about mounds in Wisconsin. I just happened to be in Wisconsin last week and visited with Gary Henschel up there near West Bend. I don't know the exact address without having a card in front of me. But on Gary's property, he has reconstructed a mound that was destroyed, but after it had been archaeologically analyzed. And it had 24 sitting position burials within the mound, and an intrusive burial in the top of the mound with about 2.5 foot deep, 20 feet long, 8 feet wide, something like that. Big pile of bones. And that goes back to your question of piles of bones. Yes, we find a lot of bones in conjunction with both the fortresses and the mounds. And the grave style varies over time, and you can actually read the timeline by how they buried their dead. But in the 6th century AD, people along the Ohio were burying their dead the same way people in Wales were burying their dead.
In the surrounding areas, has there been any evidence of Welsh words being in the Native American vocabulary or other? I mean, there's the burial, but then there are obviously other kinds of traditions that might have had an impact on the local Native tribes. Have you found anything like that to add further support?
There are several accounts of Native Americans being able to speak Welsh. And off the top of my head, I can't give you names and dates, but a lot of them are during the colony years, leading up to roughly 1836 or so, when George Catlin reported that what was left of the Mandan were using Welsh words, and they had blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin, and their boats were round and made of a wooden frame with skins over them, just like they do in Wales. So yeah, there may have been some late historical continuation, if you will. But now that's being obfuscated and hidden and dissolved and erased as fast as it can be, thanks to a guy by the name of John Wesley Powell, Major John Wesley Powell.
You know, I just think it's interesting because when people think of America, I mean, I think they pretty much see it as being void, really, of history. You know, it seems like there's more and more stuff that's starting to turn up, you know, with the Kennewick Man, the Kensington Runestone, you know, the sites that were found in, you know, on the northeast coast, you know, what you're talking about in the Ohio Valley. I mean, that's not just in one little teeny isolated area. We're talking about all over the country, and no one's looking for anything.
It drains 2/3 of the land east of the Mississippi in the United States. So yeah, I'd want to control that if I were trying to collect tithe or tax or toll. So that's one of the things I'll be talking about in Columbus, Ohio at the end of this month, May 31st, June 1st, at the Midwestern Epigraphic Society. And that one I'll be talking about text, things that I found in my travels that were written.
Give us a little spoiler. Like, I don't even know what epigraphic means, so I'm just gonna not even ask about that.
Epigraphy, it's kind of like alphabets versus calligraphy, meaning writing.
So give us, I mean, we have, I'm trying to think, the music lasts for about 2 minutes, so we have, you know, a few minutes. So give us a little teaser.
Oh, about the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I go through a short spiel, much like I opened this one, of how I got into this mess, and touch on the Welsh and on the Romans, and then I go and show an emblem that I found in northeastern Alabama at Welsh Caves, now renamed DeSoto Caves, but the local name has always been Welsh Caves. And the same symbol that was dug up at an archaeological site in Cornwall, and the same symbol attributed to Joseph Smith. And it's one of the emblems he said he saw on the golden plates.
Right. Well, that whole story with Joseph Smith and the golden plates, I just find really kind of interesting when you take into consideration his story and other stories that come out of mythology. Because didn't he find them in a cave or some kind of subterranean place, and there was an angel and all of this stuff that you find that same kind of mythology all over the place.
Yes, you do. What you don't find typically is someone who founds a religion on it and makes it work. Usually they found a religion.
I'm just not even going to touch that one.
Fail.
I'm not even going to touch that one.
It's the fastest growing religion, quote unquote, on the planet. And there are a lot of archaeological anomalies that can be interpreted as supporting the account. Now, I'm not Mormon, and I don't plan to be at any time soon, but I'll be happy to sign a book for them. So,
yeah.
Anyway, and a lot of the stuff I'm researching actually does parallel the account. I wasn't aware of that until very recently. I was just chasing down what had already been published in the 19th century and finding just a few new ones to add to it. There are maps, pre-existing maps from the 1820s on of these sites, and in that period of time, they weren't afraid to write down what they thought. It wasn't all that scientific, but when you map something out and make a drawing of it to scale, and the river is to scale and right, then you can pretty well rest assured that the rest of it's not too bad either as far as an account. Mm-hmm. But that's usually absolutely refused by current flock of archaeologists and historians.
I mean, don't you find it interesting that when you look at texts that come from the late 1800s or the 1800s and the early 1900s, they just kind of oh yeah, and they found these giants, and oh yeah, there was this, and if they had extraterrestrials, they had this extraterrestrial ship flew by, and they just are yeah, whatever. And now it's it's like it vanished from the record.
Well, Columbus's account included a UFO, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
So, cool beans.
Yeah. So if somebody wants, because the music's going to come up here in 1 second. So if somebody wants to get a copy of your book, where's the best place to send them?
If they want a signed copy, go through GraveDistractionsPublications.com or GraveDistractions.com, I should say, or Amazon if you just want to get a Kindle, which I can't sign at all. They also have print available on Amazon, as well as Barnes & Noble and a few other places. Or you can go to your library and get them to order it. Graves of the Golden Bear, Ancient Fortresses and Monuments of the Ohio Valley.
Well, cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on. I know that we're going to have you come back in a little bit to talk about Hollow Earth theory.
Yeah.
Ooh, I love that topic.
Well, I might get reinforcements for that one.
Okay. Well, you just let me know. I mean, that would be
Okay.
cool to have a little round table discussion because I don't know. I don't know if there's a big hole in the middle of the earth, but I think that there's definitely stuff going on down there.
Yeah, different than what they're telling us.
Well, they're not telling us anything, so
Pretty much.
so it has to be different than what they're telling us.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm actually putting together a book for that, which I hope to have to the publisher, GraveDistractionsPublications.com, by the end of the calendar year. I've been working on it a long time, but I have other distracting activities going on.
So is that the book you were talking about in the beginning or before we came on air, or is that a different book?
No, it's that book, and it's entitled Falling Up.
Say that again? Oh, Falling Up.
Yeah.
Ah. Okay. So, if you start digging that hole to China, you might actually end up there without a whole lot of effort kind of thing?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. No, you need all kinds of insulation because it is definitely hot in there. You have to go through the magma either way. Now, that doesn't mean there's magma at the center of the earth. It just means you have to go through the magma to get to China.
I would probably just think it's a balmy day.
Yeah, it's a nice
personally. Anyway, Rick, thank you so much for coming on the show, and we will talk to you again, wherever, Facebook, whatever.
That'll work.
But we will get you back on, when the new book comes back, talk about falling up and hollow earth theory and good stuff. Okay?
It is good stuff. Thank you, Rita.
All right, thank you, and I'll talk to you later.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, and that was Rick Osmon, and his book is Graves of the Golden Bear, available at distractionpublication.com. I probably didn't say that right, and Amazon.com. And next week, we have a good friend of mine coming back on the show. He's like the psychic extraordinaire. It's Michael Tamura, and we're talking about the science and art of clairvoyant readings. No, we will not be opening up the phone line in case you're wondering if you could get a free psychic reading, but we are going to be talking about how you can develop your psychic abilities yourself and tap into that mysterious life force energy. So until then, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Thank you all for tuning in, and be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point